I'll take the lead here introducing our second speaker for the QuakeCoRE seminar series. We're pleased to be able to have Caroline Orchiston speaking at us this morning. Caroline's at the University of Otago. She's also on the QuakeCoRE leadership team as one of our members at large. We're definitely looking forward to her presentation this morning. Just two other comments that I want to make before we get started. The first one is just a reminder to all people on the call to mute your microphone at your end. Unfortunately, we had a little bit of noise in last month's call. And the second one is that you can post questions using the chat function while the presentation is happening, and then at the end, that will allow us to sort of have a good mechanism to sequence some questions that can be posed to Caroline easy and timely manner. So with that, thanks again everyone for joining the call, and I'll hand over to you, Caroline.
Tēnā koutou katoa, everyone. Thanks a lot for having me. It's a real pleasure to be here. Thanks, Brendan. So I'm going to be spending the next half an hour or so talking you through Project AF8, how it came to be, what it's been doing, and can everyone hear me okay? I'm just hearing a bit of feedback in the background. I'll just carry on unless someone lets me know that you can't hear me clearly. So, I mean, this is a project that is really close to my heart. I've spent the last couple of years working quite extensively on this project, getting it off the ground with the amazing team that's been developed along the way around this project. And even though my career's been relatively short, it's been an absolute highlight. And I think for many of the people involved in the project, it's fair to say that this is work that we feel is actually able to make a significant contribution to societal resilience in New Zealand. So most of you will be quite familiar with the Alpine Fault as it carves its way down the western side of the Alps, and it's one of the great faults on a global scale. It's got the potential to generate a national disaster for New Zealand. And I think one of the most interesting things is the story of the Alpine Fault. We've got some great stories to tell, which are really engaging, they're compelling, and actually kind of frightening for people who we've talked to about this over the last little while. So one of those stories that I often touch base with when I introduce the Alpine Fault Scenario is how we came to know about the Alpine Fault going back into the 1940s with a rather maverick, intrepid geologist, Harold Wellman, who spent many months sort of gold prospecting and surveying his way through the west coast. And he and his sidekick, Willett, discovered the fault. You know, they saw it in the landscape and they proposed this great fault running right down the Southern Alps. And it wasn't until later, though, that he discovered a sequence of rocks down in Fiordland which were replicated up in northwest Nelson, and made the connection that these rocks had once been side by side and had been translocated by horizontal movement across the fault. Now, of course, this was highly controversial. This was after continental drift had been proposed, but before plate tectonic theory. And so this idea of faulting, active faulting, moving stuff around the planet was actually quite audacious. And so it took some time for the geological community to accept that claim. But now, of course, we know that the Alpine Fault is part of the plate boundaries. It makes its way through New Zealand, which represents, of course, the greatest seismic hazard zone across the country. So here's the Alpine Fault as it makes its way. I can't quite hear what's happening in the background. But maybe people want to mute their mics. But this is the Alpine Fault as it makes its way south off the coast into Midland. It's a beautiful, striking feature through the landscape. And another part of the story that we tell of the Alpine Fault is of the recent discoveries of the paleoseismic catalogue of earthquakes going back through time. So this is evidence discovered by a team from GNS Science, Kate Clark, Ursula Cochrane and Calvin Berryman, who discovered two sites, Hukuri Creek and John O'Groats, which have done a huge amount in terms of filling in our understanding of past Alpine Fault behaviour. So here we are in Hukuri Creek as the creek flows west out of the Alps and drains into Lake Makero on a good day when the Alpine Fault lets off a magnitude 8 earthquake. The creek is obviously impounded as it goes into the slightly uplifted western side of the fault block, and the sediment starts to accumulate into this sort of dam. And what they discovered when they went to Hukuri Creek was this beautiful sequence of sediments and the side of the creek just providing a beautiful catalogue of past events. They were able to collect datable material And what that material told them was a story of earthquakes going back over 8,000 years. And this is the sort of jaw-dropping moment that people experience when we present this data. This is what we knew before Huri Creek and John O'Groats. We knew of 3 past events in the southern section of the fault. But with the data sets generated there, we have this hugely impressive and unique long record of earthquakes going back in time. So what this shows us is 8,000 years of earthquake activity with 27 discrete events, remarkable regularity of these events, and what it really shows people is the inevitability of the next Alpine Fault earthquake. But we're now 301 years since the last event in 1717 AD. So, of course, Project AF8 has sort of emerged out of this, the need to start thinking about the Alpine Fault and start producing some plans and a response activity around how we will deal with the future Alpine Fault event. And another key goal of the project is to outreach and engage as widely as we can to help build preparedness. So here's the team. Angus McKay leads it from Southland on behalf of all 6 CDEM groups around the South Island. I help in the science coordination role, working with the team of about 30 Alpine Fault scientists to feed in the science into the project, and John Mitchell is the program manager. And the funding comes largely from McDem in terms of the proposal going in for year 1 and 2 back in 2015. Requesting $500,000, which is, at the time was quite audacious in itself, because the Resilience Fund had previously been funding small operational budgets in the regions, but nothing like this, which really showed the need for a cross-jurisdictional civil defence initiative like this to deal with a disaster of the scale that we're expecting with the Alpine Fault. And since then, we've received year 3 funding from the same fund last year to continue the work into 2019. But of course, the co-funded, the aligned science activities being huge. QuakeCoRE's generated its own cross-flagship case study to align with Project AF8, and the RNC Rural team has been instrumental in driving the project. I've been funded completely out of RNC to be part of the project. So the quantum that's come from science collaboration has at least matched what was delivered from the Resilience Fund. So the year 2 goal was really to generate this plan, the SAFER plan as it became known, South Island Alpine Fault Earthquake Response Plan. Year 3, we're looking at a lot more engagement, outreach, and more coordination of the science into the future. So Project AF8 could be thought about, I suppose, as a boundary organisation where we're developing collaborative arrangements which interface between science, policy and practice, with the aim of co-creating joint construction of knowledge to enrich this policy and practice domains, I suppose. So, we find ourselves nested quite nicely between research, policy and practice, and this is a not altogether challenging part of the world to work in. It takes a lot of time and energy and effort and communication to make this sort of thing work. But we feel as though we've had some success. But there are tensions, of course. I mean, when you're talking about scientists working with people at the coalface, the policy makers and practitioners, there are always going to be challenges. So, the science domain for us, we require credibility. We work with uncertainty and complexity. Our timeframes are quite long. We require rigorous peer review, and these are long-term research goals. But on the policy side, of course, the demands are much more for simple information, which is applied. It's interdisciplinary, and it's required in a much shorter timeframe, so that they almost have real-time requirements. And it's got to be relevant. So, we exist in this sort of hybrid zone, which is where the exciting stuff can happen, but it is the challenging area to work in. It requires a lot of legitimacy, and it demands us to find balance and to compromise, and that's largely driven through effective communication. So the Project AF8 collaboration dynamic is centred around the efforts of RNC Rural, because a lot of the funding to do this work came out of there initially. But it was also co-funded largely across all the major platforms, universities, consulting firms, etc. And the reach has been quite significant into the policy and practice domains in terms of working with ministries, local government, emergency services, all of civil defence partner agencies, and widely into communities and NGOs, etc. as well. So we've achieved a lot in a relatively short period of time. So one of the first tasks for the science team was to feed in the science in the form of a usable scenario, a credible scenario. And that sort of happened in the middle of 2016. We got a team together in Christchurch of about 30 Alpine Fault specialists, and we thrashed out the scenario, which actually we were lucky to be able to build on previous efforts. Te Ripa Hapa was the first of its kind to develop an exercise scenario for a national civil defence exercise. And so there was a lot of good work done there, which we were able to replicate or use and build on, and another scenario for the Economics of Resilient Infrastructure project. So this wasn't starting from scratch, but there was a lot of work to do. So at the workshop, we divided people into teams, and we had a couple of teams around the earth science, the fundamental source science, if you like. How will the Alpine Fault behave? What might the aftershocks look like? What are the geomorphic consequences, and how they might cascade to cause life safety issues for our response partners to deal with? And then a team around the sort of built environment and social environments as well. And as we progressed through the workshop, we realised that there were a lot of gaps, especially in these domains here around the impact and consequence science. So what we had hoped to do was pull together a full scenario, but as it transpired, in terms of feeding into what they required, in terms of developing the response plan, the hazard scenario was probably the most vital piece of information at that point, and then we endeavoured to fill the gaps on the impacts as we went forward from there. So we had a really good understanding of the hazard, but we needed more work on exposure, vulnerability, etc., in order to develop a full risk assessment to work from there. So this is what the hazard scenario ended up looking like, and it's on the Project AF8 website. So from there, the scenario was workshopped. So we took it on the road. We went around all the 6 CDEM groups, including Wellington for a national agencies workshop, and all of the work that was done in those workshops was fed directly into the safer plan development, which is almost at the point now where we can start socialising that plan. The regional workshops were really great. They were fantastic for engaging people. This is the Otago workshop. There were about 100 odd people in the room from a huge range of organisations. So it was really promising to see the level of engagement that we managed to get from the start. And since then, of course, we've been on a mission really to communicate the scenario, get out and talk to as many people as possible, workshopping, outreaching, public talks. And the science team, I have to say a massive thank you, because many of them undertook these roles to get out there and interface with agencies, etc. So it's been a huge effort, but a really rewarding one. So the way that we kind of talk about the stuff to our partners and our co-production partners or whatever is really breaking it down into the frequency magnitude kind of relationship. So what might an Alpine Fault earthquake look like? When might it occur, and how big is it likely to be? And that's something that we have a reasonably good handle on. And of course, the intensity, how long and strong might those effects be, and what the hazard footprint might look like. And again, we've got some good ideas around that. And the consequences and risk reduction. This is where a lot of energy and a lot of work's gone in over the last year or so to fill in some of those gaps. So we were really lucky. It was almost like the planets aligning in a way, because there was some research that was emerging at the time which fed beautifully into the development of the scenario. So this is some work by Brendan in terms of looking at the way the Alpine Fault might behave, the rupture initiation scenarios. So there were 3. One with the rupture initiating at the northeast part of that central section of the Alpine Fault, which we think is the most likely to generate the next big earthquake. The middle figure showing the central initiation with the bilateral radiation of that seismic energy coming out from around Haast. And then the third option being a Milford Sound rupture initiation, moving much of that seismic energy up towards the northeast. And so then we could sort of put this together. That was PGV. Now we're looking at intensity models for those same 3 scenarios, comparing that to what we knew before. This is our best estimate of an intensity model for 2013 based on Tom Robinson's work. And, you know, it's pretty good, but obviously we're getting a lot more detail, which is obviously useful for response planning. And we were able to look at find a sort of a science consensus on which of the 3 of these was the most likely to happen, and we all kind of agreed that south to north was the most likely, but also it gave us what we thought was a maximum credible event in terms of the impact and the response implications of an event like that, because the northern part of the South Island is more heavily impacted, where most of the people live in the South Island. So this is that scenario blown up, and so I think that was really useful for taking around the regions. But what really added to that was our ability to show a visualisation of that exact rupture as it played out. And I think this was just gold in terms of having this at our fingertips to show people as we went around. We've shown this numerous times now, and we never fail to get a reaction from the crowd in terms of that this sort of visualisation making it incredibly real for people. They can look at where they live in the South Island and sort of imagine what this might look like and feel like, and what the implications might be for them and their own communities. So this was hugely powerful, we found, as a tool for engagement. And so, you could start to introduce some questions here around things like the time that it takes for a rupture to fully roll out across the South Island, and the fact that, for example, Christchurch doesn't start to feel the effects of an Alpine Fault event for almost 2.5 minutes, which starts to beg the question of this early earthquake early warning system and the potential for risk reduction if we can make that work and give, for example, Christchurch and Wellington some 2 to 3 to 4 minutes to start getting prepared. And this, again, was very powerful when we were talking to Canterbury-based audiences, as they saw this, the deep sediments of the Canterbury Basin starting to reverberate with that shaking as it continues for some minutes after the event. So, just really powerful stuff. And I think thank you to Brendan for being able to deliver that to us in a timely way so that we could use it for our work. So I'm going to spend a bit of time now talking about over the sort of developments in the science around the Alpine Fault, the alignment of that science to Project AF8 since over the last couple of years, really. And it's been awe-inspiring, really, to see what's come out of this. The cross-institutional support, the multidisciplinarity of it. It's been highly collaborative, and the co-funding has actually enabled Project AF8 to carry on its work. It wouldn't have been possible without that support. And so I'd like to be able to take a moment just to say thank you, actually, on behalf of our CDEM partners, in terms of being able to work with such a forthcoming and great bunch of scientists. So as I mentioned, we have had some issues with some gaps in current knowledge, which we've been working really hard to fill. And so we engaged RiskScape. We worked out a contract with them where we were able to work collaboratively between GNS and RNC Rural, the Rural team, using a lot of their PhD students is doing quite a bit of the work to generate models specifically around building damage, habitability, casualty and injuries. And of course, no, we didn't ask a lot. We wanted them to model day and night. We wanted them to model tourist transients. These are all very, very challenging things. RiskScape perhaps wasn't fully prepared for all of those requests that we had, but we've worked through it and come to some really interesting conclusions from this work. And another great thing was being able to take the early models to steering group meetings and be able to workshop those with our group managers and sort of ground test them a little bit to see if what the models were saying actually made sense in reality, and did it look reasonable from their regional perspective, I suppose. So what we found, though, early on was that some of those early outputs were not generating enough impact. And that sounds a bit strange in a way, but we just spent 18 months talking to all of our partners about the severity of this event. It was going to be cross-jurisdictional. The whole South Island would be affected really badly. And then some of the models just weren't really reflecting that. So we had to go back to the drawing board a little bit and sort of check that we had all the right data going into the model and all of that. And Tom Wilson and his team and Nick Horsfall have been fantastic at sort of working through some of those glitches as we've gone along. So some of this work has stimulated questions around, do we actually want to look at casualty data? Do we want to make it public? Is that useful? The feedback we got from CDEM was, yes, it is. We want to know what we're in for in terms of a ballpark on regional casualty rates and things like that, and injuries. as long as they're sensible. So they really wanted to make sure that before anything was put in the plan or put into the media, that it had been, definitely ground tested and made sure that it was reasonable. And there are a lot of issues around communicating what are quite complex models. We had Tom Wilson sit down with us at the steering group meeting and talk through how to interpret these outputs that were coming through to the steering group. And, numbers and parentheses and all this sort of thing. It was confusing at first glance, and it needed someone to sit down and talk them through, what is a box and whisker plot? What does that mean to people? And so they were hugely grateful for that. They got a lot out of it. But what it said to them was the modeling's getting better, it needs more work. I guess from a science perspective, we need to validate the model, but we also need time to have it peer reviewed and things like that. So the timeframes are a little bit clashing in that the SAFER plan wants this data in it, but we're not quite fully prepared to release that sort of stuff into the public domain just yet. I've mentioned earlier the QuakeCoRE Alpine Fault case study. So there's this cross-flagship initiative which has been running for about a year. I stole this slide from Jason from last week. Sorry, Jason. And essentially, it's just picking up on what each flagship's doing and applying some of that science to an Alpine Fault, the Alpine Fault AF8 scenario. So we've got a full sort of hazard to impact assessment process, which involves at the end sort of a pipeline of work with integration there where we're actually able to talk with end users, create some useful outputs. What do they want those outputs to look like, and what do they actually want those outputs to be? So this is a really interesting project, and I'll just touch on some of the work. I've only got about a slide for each project, which is totally insufficient to give the full depth of what's been coming out of this work, but it's really exciting stuff. And of course, the RNC Rural team have been an absolute champion of Project AF8. They've got a South Island case study for the rural work. And we've been working on the Kaikoura earthquake, the community, some of the social responses there, but also Tom's had some students getting some great work done in terms of the rural communities using the AF8 scenario, which I'll touch on in a moment. So this is some of the cross-flagship work. This is work done by Mishko, looking at applying the Alpine Fault scenario to Christchurch and looking at using the catalogue of liquefaction data sets from the Darfield and the Christchurch earthquakes, using both simple and advanced some modelling techniques. And at this point, having gone through the process of using the more simple modelling, it looks as though the likelihood of liquefaction being generated by a long-duration Alpine fault quake is relatively low, but of course there's a lot more modelling to be done. So this is, initially seems like quite good news for Christchurch in that the nature of this long-duration shaking might not generate as much liquefaction, nearly as much liquefaction as they experienced in the past, but there's more work to be done. Flagship 3, Jason would have talked through quite a bit of their planning around their case study work on the Alpine Fault, but essentially they're using a lot of lessons learned from the Christchurch URM behaviours, so the way the buildings behaved during those quakes, and also using some new technologies such as photogrammetry and LiDAR to capture some really cool images of heritage buildings. I've been working with Jason down in Oamaru, so his team of Parko and Stacey, the PhD students, have been doing some drone flights, and just really, it's really cool, engaging kind of science that the end users absolutely love. I've been sending images up to the guy who runs the Whitestone Civic Trust, and he just thinks they're amazing. And also working on a fourth objective around regional casualty modelling for some of these communities using the RISE dataset. Liam, who tells me he's off fishing today, which is perfectly fine, is working on a lot of this infrastructure disruption work, and this is pushing out the original scope of AF8 was the first 7 days of response, but looking well beyond that now, which is fantastic, looking at the disruption and the restoration of critical infrastructure well into 6 months post-event, which is really cool stuff. And looking at the direct and indirect sort of interdependencies of our critical infrastructure. And while I don't have much time to go into depth on this one, I guess one really interesting thing for me is noting how the electricity infrastructure is so closely coupled with the reinstatement of telecom, the comms network. And, from a response perspective, that's incredibly powerful. If you don't have power, you don't have comms. And if they don't have sat phones, they're in big trouble. And Flagship 5, this work is looking at an Alpine Fault scenario, but looking at Wellington in terms of government productivity and using the merit model to do some work there. And some of their early modelling is due, I think, in mid-April, so we're a month away from seeing some of those results. Back to RNC Rural, so Ali Davies' work has been really cool. He's again working on what we're calling the AF8 plus scenario, so looking well beyond the first 7 days of the response in isolated communities. So you've got a place like Franz Josef, for example, a resident population of 300, potential to have many thousands, if not, well, up to 4,000 or 5,000 visitors on a given day if it's peak season. What will they do if they have to deal with that number of extras in their community for a period of time, a prolonged period of time? So he's working with community members, the West Coast Lifelines groups and Civil Defence, Electronet and KiwiRail, and really workshopping through the scenario in really a very participatory way. So they're looking at the models and then the disruption to their local infrastructure, highway network, for example, and then actually estimating level of service based on what they're seeing and from their own regional perspective, which I think is really powerful because it gives them insights and they're thinking it through for themselves rather than being told exactly what other people think. So, yeah, Ali's at pains to keep reinforcing and wisely that this is a scenario, this is one scenario event, and many different outcomes will probably happen that we don't anticipate. But this is, yeah, again, just looking at the level of service, and it's quite scary to note that South Westland will be, in their opinion, isolated by road for more than 6 months, and this is really interesting stuff in terms of how communities might survive a period of isolation like that. One of the other pieces of work that we're really pushing over the last 6 months has been around the outreach and engagement, and we employed a production company to develop some video resources for us. We wanted it to be proactive, not kind of doom and gloom, so we did one short video about why we need to be worried about the Alpine Fault. And then we did a series of videos on community resilience narratives or stories that have emerged that we are aware of, where communities are being really proactive about building their own resilience. So those videos are finished now. We've got also 4 science talks that we filmed because there's been such a huge appetite for the science, and so we're making those available. And we're really pleased to say that RNZ has come on board and they're going to host those videos on their platform, which is a big coup really, because they've got really great reach. They've got many thousands of people that watch their channel already, and it's growing, so we're really pleased about that. We've also managed to get the AF8 scenario into the National Exercise Program as a Tier 4 exercise, a national scale civil defence exercise, and that's in the schedule for 2020, so there's a lot of work to do to prepare for that. So I'm just going to wind up now with just a couple of lessons to date. I suppose, you know, there's been a huge appetite for this more applied resilience work, building on that strong foundation of the fundamental science. So we're really working hard to, you know, the science team's working hard to address those gaps in knowledge. So we took initially an expert panel approach to assessing regional risk, but now we've been able to develop a whole lot more models that can start to fill those gaps. Obviously, from a civil defence perspective, the life safety risk is their greatest concern. So that's why the scope of Project AF8 was the first 7 days. And so those specific models coming through RiskScape are exactly what they need. So we need to make sure that those are valid and useful models that can be useful, usable and used. And there's also an increasing demand from other agencies for impact and exposure modelling for their own purposes. So just last week we had, or last month, Corrections made contact with us and said, look, we want some basic exposure models of what our facilities, where they sit in terms of the intensity of shaking that might be generated. So Tom was able to whip those up pretty quickly with help from his team. And so that's great to be able to meet that need, but we are slightly concerned that it's almost like a consulting job, and will we be able to continue to meet that future demand if this thing carries on well into the future? Communication, I think, is a really interesting thing. We've had to target outputs for practitioners, but Do we always understand what they need? Do they always understand what's available or what we can do for them? So again, there's this really important need for communication across those. How do they want their outputs to look, etc. And Tyler Barton, who again is working up at Canterbury, he's doing some great work on his PhD, looking at that stuff. Time frame issues, definitely, in terms of delivery of the science, making sure that it's robust and peer reviewed, and all of those challenges associated with working in the hybrid zone. And finally, I think it's just important to note that co-creation, it takes a real village to generate something like this. You know, that saying, it takes a village to raise a child. Well, it takes a village to raise a project AF8. It's a co-creation model that takes effort to sustain. It needs a lot of coordination across those domains, and a lot of meetings and a lot of face-to-face communication. One thing I've really enjoyed observing, actually, is getting all the group managers into the same room every 2 months and watching them dissect, you know, things that have happened in their own regions lately, recent responses they've had to deal with, and just learning lessons about all of that stuff as they go along. It's been really interesting to see that happening. And I think working to the strengths of the team. So, I mean, we had some aspirational ideas about how we might outreach and communicate, but we had a comms committee full of really experienced PIMs, public information managers, been working in the sector for years, who were able to sort of make that a bit more real and actually translate our aspirations into action and outreach progress. And I think, yeah, finally, mutual respect is absolutely crucial. All parties speak their own language and have their own strengths, which take time to understand. So I think that's been a really interesting learning curve for all of us. Anyway, I'd like to leave it there, and thank you so much for listening, and I'm happy to take questions.
Thank you so much, Caroline, for a very informative and interesting talk, and a lot of great slides and information through. So there weren't any premeditated chat questions that people logged during the presentation, but I wonder if anyone wants to ask a question now. Of course, you're previously on mute, so if you are interested, make sure you turn your microphone on mute and feel free to ask Caroline. Yeah. We do have a question. We're just checking how far away from the... Can you hear me, Caroline?
Oh, you're not too shy to ask a question, John, are you?
I'll never like that. Do anything. Do you hear me? Okay.
I can, kind of. You're a bit muffled, but I'll do my best.
I'm just wondering, in all your all the people you've worked with, have you worked with anybody from the legal sector, from law, or from? I was wondering about all. It strikes me that as we move into particularly the longer term, after 7 days into longer, you get lots of governance issues. Who's going to do this? Whether there's legal powers to deal with these sort of incidents that you've never dealt with before. So I wasn't sure if you'd engage with that at all.
Yeah. I'm not sure if everyone else outside Christchurch is having the same issues as me with hearing what's happening in that room, but it's very muffled. But I think I got the gist of what you were asking, which is, have we engaged with law people who have a legal brain, and because they're the ones that are going to be having to deal with some of the implications of this. And the answer to that is, well, I've had some chats with you and some other people, and Elon's pretty switched on when it comes to that stuff too, but no. And I think this is another big gap that we have acknowledged exists, and I think is being addressed in some ways by working on, for example, the QuakeCoRE Wellington coordinated project, where we have a whole work stream around the regulatory issues of a Wellington event and a cordoning of the CBD, things like that, and the legal consequences of that. So I think those conversations are so vital to be having, and it's still early days, but I think we will definitely head in the direction of having more of those conversations and making some real ground on that. I hope that...
Caroline, awesome presentation. Thank you very much. All of the maps we see are all the impacts on the South Island. Are there any impacts from this event on the Lower North Island? And is that part of the scope?
Yeah, so, well, it kind of, the Project AF8 scope was the South Island, but we know that there will be impacts on the Lower North Island. And Brendan's been working on some stuff around that, especially. But we deliberately didn't model the impacts across the whole island, because our scope was those 6-7 groups in the South Island. But we do talk about the lower North Island being implicated in this as well. So, but you're right, it's probably a gap. We need to fill that one too.
Yeah. Cool.
Thanks, John and Tracy, for your questions. Any other questions we can tempt people to ask?
Yeah, please. Hi, I'm Simon. Just a very quick question. If I was at Tahana on the West Coast, would I have heard about this already? And how would I react to it?
Did you say if you're a homeowner on the West Coast?
No, Tahana. I am on the West Coast.
Sorry, I still didn't.
Tahana on the West Coast. Hotel.
Hotel owner. Hotel. Okay, sorry, you said hotel, right? Sorry, you're still really muffled, but yes, if you said hotel, yes. Now, this is a specific interest of mine. I've done quite a bit of work on tourism and earthquakes. My PhD actually looked at the outcomes of an Alpine Fault event on tourism activity around the Southern Alps. So I think it's fair to say that, well, at least back then when I was doing my PhD, there was a reasonably good understanding of the likelihood and the likelihood of an Alpine Fault event, but the consequences not so much. And so I think since then there would have been an increase in the level of awareness, just because there's a lot more conversation happening around it. But I think there's still a lot more work to do in tourism. There's a PhD going on right now out of Massey, Nancy Brown, who I'm co-supervising. She's looking at hotel resilience in Wellington and on the East Coast in Hawke's Bay. So she's specifically looking at their level of preparedness for future major events. What else can I tell you about that? Oh, we're also proposing to do some work that will bring tourism much more into the response sort of picture, because right now tourism is a tricky one. We don't know where tourists necessarily are day by day as they make their way around New Zealand. Until we have a decent flows model, we're not going to have a better handle on that really, but we need to work better to integrate tourism and civil defence in terms of that response prioritisation. So right now I'm actually about to hopefully launch some work on that specifically, and that'll target regional tourism organisations, the Ministry of Civil Defence and MB as the tourism central government agency, and how they can work better together.
Any final questions?
Very simple. Caroline, if you can hear me, simple question: how on the basis of the program of the project, how prepared is the South Island?
Well, it's all relative, but I would say in the last 2 years we've come a huge way, getting a lot more prepared. The conversations that are happening are just are huge, and that is a real groundswell of interest in the Alpine Fault and in getting better prepared for it. So I think, there's never an end point when we're perfectly prepared for this thing, but I think we're definitely going in the right direction, and Project AF8 has helped facilitate a lot of that. So I think it's definitely doing a good job in that respect.
Okay, on behalf of everyone, Caroline, thanks once again for being our second speaker as part of the QuakeCoRE seminar series. For those both that listened to today and are interested to go back and hear some of what Caroline mentioned, this video has been recorded, so it will be available, and also therefore you can let any people know that weren't able to make it today that they can get access to this as well. So thanks once again very much, Caroline. I really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Have a good day, everyone.